Hello you! We are drawing a portrait of the OG terror reader with a spark of rage. Since 2016, he's been dragging humanity with the cards, and honestly, we deserve it. 177 million views later, 600,000 people still line up to get roasted. I mean, bread. He's witty.
Go to urgent care. You gonna need urgent care if you keep fucking with me.
He's blunt.
You son of a bitch.
He's hilarious.
But Tyler, we're time travelers. We came in from the 1800s. They didn't have...
Honest, accurate, humble. He's allergic to nonsense.
Stop asking me questions, please.
Inspirational?
Yes!
Patient?
No!
Forget tarot. He's a fire hazard stand-up comedian with a deck of cards and a permanent state of mild annoyance.
Chalice tarot, ho!
And this is how I drew him. This tutorial is divided into individual parts. Timestamps are in the description box. First, I will show you the materials and how I use them in this drawing, and then I'll start with the drawing process. Some parts are longer because they took longer to draw and or they were significant to the outcome. I will be stopping a few times during this tutorial to show you my point, so this is not a continuous video. If you want an uninterrupted version with no voiceover, watch the time-lapse version. Let's go. I am aware I used many different tools, but I use them because I have them and they make my life easier. You can still achieve a similar outcome if you don't have some of these tools. However, there are some that I consider essential without which I know I wouldn't be able to reach the same look. Tombow Mono Eraser, a necessity for every graphite artist who loves precision. My own graphite powder, made by grinding a 9B Faber-Castell stick. Kohinoor graphite powder, helps with smoothing out the surface and blending things together. 14B Pit Matte pencil, the darkest graphite pencil I own. An old used blending stick, used because the majority of its surface and core is covered in graphite, therefore blends like butter, makes the blended surface look smooth with no patches or streaks. A kneaded eraser. I think this blue one from Kohinoor is a good middle ground. It's not too soft, not too hard, you're able to get great detail with it. You can adjust the hardness of it depending on how much heat you expose it to. I've been using these for 10 years. It is inevitably the most essential eraser for graphite drawing. Fabriano Artistico Hot Press Watercolor Paper in Classic White. Faber-Castell 9000s. Faber-Castell Pit Mattes. Kohinoor Graphite Powder. My own powder. A soft bristle brush. Blending sticks. Kneaded erasers. Tombow Mono Eraser. Derwent battery operated eraser. A brush with hard bristles, and a white gel pen. Faber-Castell 9000s. I used HB, B and 2B all the way to 8B, but really you don't need all of them. I think you'll be fine with a 2B, 4B, 6B and an 8B. In this portrait I used these all over. For the skin I used the 2B Jumbo with a dull tip and mostly 3, 4, 5 and 6B. For the smallest details and for a seamless blend, I used a B and a 2B. I love these for drawing skin because they blend very evenly, streak-free. Also, you'll see me use a different approach to using these. Most people go from hardest to softest, and once they use the softest, they won't use a harder lid. I do. I love using the B and the 2B to blend the layers underneath, when I don't want to blend away and lighten, but keep the value and mix it in with the rest. It's also a good technique to reduce the look of the white of the paper peeking through. These pencils are also hard to completely blend away like the pit mattes are. I also use them on top of the pit mattes on the shirt. Faber-Castell pit mattes. I used 6, 8, 10, 12 and 14B. I use them for the stubble and on the shirt. They are very easy to blend, which makes them very easy to blend away, so whenever I use them on larger areas, they serve as a foundation. I really like these for drawing hair, facial hair, fur, and textiles. If I could go back, I would draw Tyler's hair using these, as these don't leave a glare. Kohinoor graphite powder. Used it on his face and neck primarily. Great for blending and smoothing out. Not really buildable, leaves a glare and prevents you from adding more layers on top if you use too much. My own powder, made by grinding a 9B Faber-Castell stick, has the same qualities except this one is buildable, doesn't leave much of a glare and you can add more layers on top of it. If overused, the area gets way too dark and streaky when using a brush. Also has a tendency to erase layers underneath, so it has to be used carefully. A soft bristle brush. For the powder, natural bristles work best. Blending sticks, an old one and a new one. The old one serves as a time saver as it leaves the same finish as using a pencil and blending it on small areas. The new one is for softening small details. Kneaded erasers. Both are Kohinoor, one is red, one is blue. The red is very soft, doesn't like to keep its shape, great for lightening up areas, lifting just enough pigment but not erasing the layers underneath. The blue one keeps its shape. I always hold it in my hand to keep it warm, because the warmth keeps it soft. Great for small and large details, a staple for me. Tumble mono eraser. I use the one with the rounded tip. I wouldn't draw in photorealism if this didn't exist. It is a must-have. You can get the smallest details with this, but keep in mind it also has its limits. The larger the size of your project, the easier to use this eraser is. Derwent battery-operated eraser. I only used it once in this drawing, so not necessary here. But it is great for completely erasing an area if you messed up. Keep in mind it has a larger tip, so it works better for larger scale artwork. A brush with hard bristles. This is the other end of a Faber-Castell pencil eraser. It is perfect for removing the bits left on the surface after erasing, a necessity for me, as I do not like to touch my drawings during any part of the process. I find it unsanitary and potentially damaging due to the oils on your skin. And blowing the eraser bits away I find also unsanitary and useless, as it doesn't help to remove all of them sometimes. White gel pen. Used only on the white highlights on the eye, and the sharpener of course. This is the reference photo we are working with. My goals for my drawing were to obviously make it look like the photo. I knew I wanted a white background, so I had to hype up the contrast to make it look in unison with the background. That being said, the sclera and the teeth had to be darkened, because they were a little too white for my liking. Remove the seatbelt, a bit more detail on the hair, and a bit more texture on the skin, and this is what I ended up with. I began the portrait by a thin layer of Kohinoor graphite powder all over the surface. This layer makes it easier to blend other layers on top. Starting off at the right orbital region, I roughly blocked in the initial shadow shapes using a B. Then I blocked in the iris and pupil. Notice I'm not drawing the eye the way it looks up close in a book. I'm drawing what I see. Blocks of shadows and highlights. Even the pupil may not always appear like a perfect circle, like in this portrait. The beauty of it is that you wouldn't notice unless you're aware of it not being the shape it's supposed to be. I added in lashes pretty early on, which I normally wouldn't do, but I felt the need to draw them because I needed to see the shape of the eye better. And it wouldn't be possible without the lashes, since they add not only the shape but the curvature of the whole side of the face. I needed the angle to be right initially, which prevented me from making mistakes later on. Notice I only blocked the lashes in, I didn't make them perfect on purpose. I still needed to finish the background, the upper eyelid, crease, and the orbital part of the eyelid. I also drew the eyebrow following the angle and the anatomy of the face. First I sketched the angle and length of the hairs using a 5B, blended it with a bit of powder, added the darkest part and drew in some individual hairs to make the shadow less graphic. I did the same on the left eye, you'll be able to see better. Blocked in the darkest parts, blended with powder, darkened the lines and started adding more detail. I draw in layers, this makes it easier for me, as it adds less pressure to make it perfect immediately and gives it more dimension. Since you don't have to overdraw the whole layer you just blended, you can draw just where you need it. I'm using pencils all the way from B to 8B, starting with the hardest lead. On areas that are black, like parts of the iris and pupil, I only use the 8B. I find it sticks the best and looks the darkest when I only use this one pencil. Notice I didn't leave the sclera white. Why? Because it's not white. It has layers underneath, and it has a round shape, which inevitably gives it a shadow, which we should draw if we're going for a realistic look. I did the same thing with the lashes as I did on the right side of his face. Then I added some highlights and I drew the eyebrow the same exact way as the right one. Keep in mind, I draw every portrait differently. If you watch my time lapses, you'll see the process is always changing, because every portrait I feel requires a different approach. Some portraits, like the Dave Chappelle portrait, required a more graphic, geometric approach, whereas Tyler's required details almost immediately. I also draw in sections and rarely finish them completely before I move on to the next section. It is bad for the cinematic quality of the video, but it makes sense to me, so that's why I do it this way. Feel free to do this your own way, you don't have to do anything like I do, I'm only here to show you my way. This stage took about 2 hours to draw. Moving on to the nasal region, same approach, blocking in the shapes with a 7B, starting with the darkest shadow on the nostrils, the ala and the columella. I highlighted the tip of the nose with my kneaded eraser and continued with the shadows on the columella and the sidewall with either a 3 or a 4B. It doesn't really matter. The point is to get the value and the shape right. I continued shaping the nose by erasing, blending, adding more layers over and over again, according to my reference photo. I added some freckles and other details. Later, I went back and changed the angle of the dorsum, because it wasn't looking right. You'll see. We are at 3 hours and 15 minutes into the process in real time. The hair on this one was pretty easy. I began by shaping the curls with a 3B and slowly started darkening with a 5B. Filled it in, blended, outlined and began darkening. I'm using a 9B from a different brand, but not for long, because the lead fell out of the bottom. So I changed it for the Faber 8B. After filling in, I started blending and refining, adding more layers. I set in my goals for this drawing that I want to make the hair more three-dimensional, so I worked in layers for the effect of depth. The side part with the shortest hair in the temporal region was done using all of the soft pencils from 2 to 8B. Many layers here. The back part is purely black. Look at this line. I purposely didn't make it straight. The hair in this part is short, which naturally creates a zigzaggy line. It wouldn't look real if I drew an even, perfect line. If I could go back, I would draw the hair with the pit mats. I would avoid the ugly glare that using the 9000s did, and I would get the hair to look even darker. Very important, when you see such a stark contrast between two adjacent parts of a whole, it is necessary to blend the line between them. It is well blended on the reference photo, but since we tend to simplify when drawing, you may overlook it. Another example of the importance of eye rest and focus. I added a thin layer of a 3 or 4B all over, blended with powder, went back with another layer, blended again, added highlights, darkened parts that needed to be darkened with a 6B, closely watching my reference photo. It is essential to keep the shapes right to ensure correct anatomy while focusing on the values as well. It is always better to have things too light than too dark, because adding more graphite is easier than removing it and not disrupting the layers underneath. That is why I'm very careful and it takes me this long to finish a project. I am terrified of making things too dark, damaging the tooth of the paper and being unable to go back and add more layers. Also, this paper doesn't allow too many layers, so the thinner the layers are, the better. I don't think I need to explain every stroke I do, you can see what I'm doing and where. Drawing ears in this angle is unenjoyable and easy to mess up, so I took my time. I added a snippet of a different angle so we can see better. Same technique. Blocked in the darkest areas, blended, added more layers, highlighted, and so on. The most challenging part of this ear was the perfect balance of a very defined line and an enough blended line between the helix, the scapha, and the antihelix. The antitragus blending into the earlobe also took a delicate hand. This ear is proof that you're not drawing an ear, you're drawing what you see in the reference photo. If you drew the ear the way it's supposed to look like, it wouldn't fit the rest of the face because there are shadows cast on the face which play with the way the organ ends up looking on a photo. Now, the most significant part of the whole drawing. We are at around the 5-hour mark in real life. If the teeth didn't turn out right, the whole portrait would have sucked.
Ridiculous!
You wouldn't be able to point what's exactly off when a cheek is a little too chubby, a scar that's a millimeter off, a chin that's too pointed, or poorly shaped ala. But you will be able to point out teeth. That's why many people despise drawing them. I quite enjoy it, even though it can get frustrating sometimes. This section itself took more than 3 hours, which proves how important it was for me. My trick is very thin layers, lots of erasing with my red Kohinoor kneaded eraser, and using harder lead pencils, mainly an F, a B, and a 2B. The inside of the mouth was done with a 2, 4, 6, and 8B. The first thing I did was carve out the shapes. I blocked in the darkest parts, blended, refined, blended. This helped me with the right values of the teeth later on, as well as lowered the risk of darkening the teeth if I had drawn them before. I had to be careful around the pteromandibular fold and the palatal surface of his premolars on his right side. You'll see how many different shadows and shapes there are cast on his left by the tongue, as well as his premolars and molars. It was overwhelming, but whenever I work on something this complicated, I work slowly, closely watching my reference photo and working in thin layers. Also, I left his lips bare. This made the judgment of my values more difficult, but since his lips are not very defined, I would have to draw the whole oral region, which could have smudged once I came back to draw the teeth. So I worked from what's furthest away from me, the inside of the mouth, out. If I were drawing a woman who tend to have a more distinct vermilion border, I would have drawn the lips first, at least get the values so the teeth would be easier to draw. Back to the teeth. I drew them simultaneously with the gums. You can't see much of his gums anyway, so there was no reason for me to draw them separately. I began with the light blended layer, and then I kept erasing and highlighting it until it looked realistic. You'll see me use very little pencil or a drawing stick here, because his teeth are quite white. I also had to use my imagination and knowledge of anatomy to add my highlights, because as you can see on the reference photo, there isn't much detail. The tricky part is to make them look shiny, white enough but not too white, dark enough but not too dark. Drawing teeth is alchemy and a patience test in one. I actually thought about starting the drawing with them, because if they didn't turn out right, the whole drawing would have to be remade. But I reminded myself of my previous drawings where I managed to draw them quite well. Self-confidence plays a huge role in photorealism, I feel. The lines along the occlusal surface are much sharper than the lines connecting the teeth with the gums. If I left these lines as sharp as the occlusal, the teeth would look fake, crown-like. Also, their sharpness depends on if they're in focus, so in this case, his right side is more out of focus, which means there is less detail and almost no sharp lines, whereas on his left, look at the mesial lines, the ones closer to the front tooth, on his upper incisor number 22, canine 23 and premolar 24. All of these lines are sharp, but low in value. Not every sharp line you make has to be dark, remember that. Sharp lines have values too, not just shadows. Here I planned on continuing from left to right, but I changed my mind and moved on to the upper lip area. Moving on to the upper lip region. That's where I began using the pit mats. First, I used the 6B to draw some hairs, went over with an 8B to darken certain areas, blocked in his upper lip with a classic 2B and my old blending stick, and started adding highlights on the stubble. I drew his upper lip along with the stubble because his vermilion border isn't very defined. I had to be careful when blending the lip not to smudge the teeth. I also checked up the columella and the nasal sill shadows. More details on the stubble with a matte 10B and then just refining. The shapes are mostly little flicks and small dots here and there, irregular of course for a more realistic look. My trick is letting my hand do whatever it wants to do. I have fun with this part. It looks the scariest to draw, but it is a lot of fun. I'm focusing on a top lip. There is more work to do than one might think. As you can see, I'm going back and forth between my 2B pencil, kneaded erasers made into a point, my blending stick and my Tombow mono eraser. This is one of those instances where you think you can rush through this part because it's not as exciting, but you're wrong. Every part deserves close attention and refining. Onto his right cheek. I began with some highlights as the area was looking a bit dull, on the side of the nose, just where the nasolabial folds are. My intention was to make it look like pores, but since this area is slightly out of focus and light, it was an unnecessary detail that I later removed. Then I moved on to the crease underneath his eye, made it sharper and added more lines and highlights. Darkened the shadow that the radix casts. And here I changed the shape of the bridge of the nose, as it wasn't as narrow as I made it. It has a little bump just where the rhinion is. Moving on to the mental region along with the bottom lip. We are at around 10.5 hours in real time. I began with the lip, a thin layer of my Jumbo 2B pencil, highlighting with my kneaded eraser, more pencil, jumbo and thin, and more erasing just to make map of where the highlights and shadows are. Then I used the same technique as for the stubble mustache, 6/8 and 10B pit mats for the hairs, closely watching my reference photo to keep its shape. I'm going all over the place because 1, I can't focus, and 2, to rest my eyes from a particular area. I have to take regular breaks because after a while, usually 30 minutes, I can't see anymore. I have to look at something else and then come back to see the detail again. That's why I'm jumping all over the place, and that's why my technique is not really tutorial friendly. The highlights that were made with the Tombow Mono eraser were done the same way as the hairs, so an irregular small stroke motion. I'm not pressing too hard because I don't want to remove what's underneath the highlight, I want to lighten the area. If I need to erase something to a white, I'll use more pressure. Remember to dust off where you just erased with a stiff brush, not your hand. These particles will damage your drawing if you try to draw over them. And if you use your hand to remove them, you'll likely smudge your drawing, and/or some of the oils from your hand may transfer and damage the paper, therefore the whole drawing. I began working on his left side of the chin and working more on the stubble beard. Again, everything is done in layers. I blend between layers. In the beginning, when I don't have that many layers down, I'll use some powder with my blending brush, and later on, when I've got plenty of layers, I'll just use the brush. No powder, because the powder does remove some of the graphite that's on the paper, which would make the layering useless. I use a very light hand when blending because if you add too much powder on the surface, it will prevent you from adding more layers on top. I know it sounds very frustrating, but it is. That's why the best teacher is practice and getting to know your own tools. I did use the regular 9000s later when the beard was in. The 9000s are softer and harder to smudge with a brush, so I didn't affect my layers with blending with a brush. At the end, the initial pit matte small stroke layers ended up looking almost like an even, uniform layer with a hint of the detail underneath, which with the sharper layers on top made it look much more realistic than if I tried to draw the stubble in one go. And the beautiful thing is that there aren't many distinct hairs if you look closely, not too many sharp lines, just enough to give the effect. If I drew individual little dots all over his chin, it will look like pepper, not a stubble. I also had to consider the little creases and folds on the tip. Those two that you see are pretty dark. They look too dark with just the face done, but when the whole portrait is finished, they will blend in just fine. After that, I went back to finish the buckle region with just a few small details and mostly erasing because I made it way too dark initially. This area is out of focus and I didn't want it to take away from the beauty of the stubble. I added a thin layer of a 2B onto his zygomatic region, as well as the whole neck pretty much, and blended that with powder. Then I added the long highlight on his cheek, right where the malar fat pad is. I did another thin layer of 4B underneath his eyes and down to approximately where the zygomatic bone ends. Now I'm focused on the orbit of the eye. We are at around 12 hours and 15 minutes in real time. I'm adding harsher and darker lines, softening them where it's needed, adding more highlights and so on, watching my reference photo, trying to recreate what I see. I wasn't happy with the way the tear-through looked, so I took my time to make it more believable. This area only took me an hour for reference. You may also notice I went from big to small, so bigger shadows and highlights to dots. Now we're moving on to his left cheek. I started with the upper cheek, continued on his lower cheek down to his neck. I didn't separate the head and the neck because in this photo, there is no distinct border between them. And we are working with a stubble too, so I do not want to make it look disconnected. We are currently at 13 hours and 15 minutes in real time. I started off with the infraorbital region. First, I finished the highlight. As you can see, it is not a solid shape. There are many little shapes within it, mostly pores that don't look like pores up close. I couldn't get them the way I wanted them to look, honestly. The surface is too small for such a detail and my patience. It would take me at least 2 hours to get those pores to my liking, and at the end it would be unnecessary. The detail is not visible in the reference photo, so yes, it would make my drawing more hyperrealistic if I added those pores, but I wasn't going full hyperrealism. I'm fine with photorealism. I also think that adding too much detail can sometimes be damaging. Less is more, really. What I found is that if I focus on the detail that I can actually see on my reference photo, and I sharpen it just a little, maybe amp up the contrast, it will serve the drawing much more than adding detail from my imagination or experience. There isn't much anatomy to the fine details on the cheek that I'm adding here. It's just skin imperfections. But even these have to follow the direction and angle of the muscles underneath. For example, the highlight that's going towards the ear is following the direction of the zygomaticus minor. That's why if you add these highlights or shadows in the wrong place, the face shape changes completely. You have to take muscles and fat into account. Onto the stubble. I drew my first layer with the Pit Matte 6B. Then I added some highlights with my kneaded and Turbo Mono eraser, again following the direction according to my reference photo. The pattern I'm making with the Turbo Mono is not the same as the pencil. I'm using more of a continuous chaotic scribble. I lightened the area just underneath the zygomaticus minor, and then I continued with the hair using 8B and 10B mattes. Before I finished the stubble, I finished the upper cheek. The infratemporal region needed some more work, and the nasolabial fold as well. I briefly went back and did some touch-ups around the mouth and chin. Continuing with the stubble, I knew I needed the area around the mandible to be darker. It was a little too difficult to judge just how dark, so I darkened it slowly and surely, making sure I don't lose the texture. Look closely, you can see there are multiple textures going from the zygomatic bone down to his shirt, even though it's the same stubble. If I were to make it look uniform, it wouldn't look realistic at all. Not only the hair creates texture, but the skin as well. Skin forms different patterns as well. In this case, his mandibula is not sharply defined due to the position of his head, so fat and muscles come into play. Working in layers made it easier for me to make the whole lower cheek and neck look connected and ensure there are no visible lines from sections if I worked in them. I have to admit the different textures made this part challenging and time-consuming, but I managed to push through with frequent breaks and focus. Darkening the shadow underneath the chin was so satisfying. You know I love contrast. Those folds on his neck show how lines don't have to be dark to be sharp. Look at the finished piece. Do you see the blend of blended and unblended lines, shadows, and highlights? This diversity will make your drawings much more realistic. We are approximately 16 hours into the drawing. I'm using the same technique as I did for the skin. Sketching in the darkest areas, blending, adding more layers with pencils, blending in between, highlights and more layers and blending. Important to mention here is that I used a different graphite powder. I used my own powder that I made from a 9B Faber-Castell stick. It has much more grip and punch. It's very easy to overdo, but it's perfect for darker skin tones or areas in general, because it has more grip, therefore you can add more layers on top. If I used the Kohinoor powder here, it would take me much longer to finish the shirt, because I would have to do all the darkening by pencil, and making it as smooth as this would take hours and hours of careful layering and blending. The right side was pretty easy, but I did struggle on his left side. You'll see how I changed the fold multiple times, and that is because there is a seat belt on the reference photo, which I wanted to remove, so I tried multiple folds to see which one worked. what made this shade realistic were the little dots representing the seam on the neck. It's a collection of dots and very short lines, both with pencil and eraser. Again, if I made this uniform and perfect using dots of the same size and distance, it will look cartoony. Going from top to bottom, I burnished the darkest parts of the hair using my 14B pit matte. It doesn't lay well on top of the 9000, but oh well.
Who gives a shit, right?
Darkened the shadows on top on his right side of the forehead, added some more freckles, blended to make the skin smoother. The point of this step is to make everything look in unison, compare everything with the reference photo, correct any differences, maybe make some differences. I never make the corrections in one go. The process you see here took about an hour, but it usually takes me 2 to 3 days of this step before I call the piece finished. I look at it under different lighting conditions, I take photos and compare the artwork and the reference side by side. Sometimes I have to scan it thinking it's finished, just to find out it needs a little erasing here or a little more contrast there. So this step is ever-changing, chaotic and sad, because you are hit with the feeling of finishing another piece, being at the end, already reminiscing the process and the times during which the artwork was done. The music you were listening to, the thoughts you had, is bittersweet.
Your father's here.